This is the best meal we've had in ages.
You all worked so hard on it.
And the company makes it perfect. See? It's catching.
Whoa, cool.
Careful now.
The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet village, painting the dusty roads in soft gold. It was the kind of morning people usually loved, warm, hopeful, and full of celebration. Drums echoed in the distance, children ran through the streets waving small flags, and neighbors greeted each other with wide smiles. It was Independence Day, the one day of the year when everyone in the village came together to celebrate freedom, unity, and a shared future. But for one man standing alone near the old baobab tree at the edge of the market square, the cheerful words, "Happy Independence," felt like something very different. His name was Kofi. Most people in the village knew Kofi, but not many truly understood him. He was a tall, quiet man with sharp eyes and a face that rarely showed emotion. While others laughed and danced, Kofi usually kept to himself, working long hours repairing tools and farming equipment in his small wooden workshop. Some said he had always been serious. Others whispered that life had hardened him in ways nobody could fully see. That morning, as the celebrations grew louder, Kofi stood with his arms crossed, watching the crowd from a distance. "Happy Independence," someone shouted nearby. The words floated through the air like confetti. People repeated them again and again. Smiles, laughter, singing. Everywhere you looked there was joy. But when Kofi heard those same words, something in his expression shifted. He tightened his jaw. To most people it was just a greeting, a simple phrase shared between neighbors. But for Kofi, those two words carried memories he had spent years trying to bury. Memories that refused to stay quiet, especially on a day like this. Across the square, a group of young men began beating drums, their rhythm growing louder as more villagers gathered around to dance. Women in bright traditional cloth clapped along, and elders sat beneath the shade of mango trees, telling stories about the struggles their ancestors faced before freedom came. The village chief stood near the center of the square, greeting everyone who passed. "Happy Independence," he said warmly. People shook his hand and thanked him, proud of their history. But Kofi didn't move. He kept watching and remembering. Years ago, Independence Day had meant something to him too. He used to stand in this very square with the same excitement everyone else felt. Back then, he believed the celebrations meant opportunity, a promise that things would get better for people like him. But somewhere along the way, that belief had cracked. Some villagers noticed him standing alone. "There's Kofi again," a woman whispered softly to her friend. "He never celebrates," the friend replied. "Maybe he just prefers quiet. Maybe. Or maybe there was more to the story." Just then, a cheerful young boy ran past Kofi, nearly bumping into him as he waved a small flag in the air. "Happy Independence, sir," the boy said brightly before continuing down the road. The words were innocent, pure. The boy didn't wait for a reply. But Kofi remained still. For a moment, the sounds of drums and laughter faded behind the noise inside his own mind. "Happy Independence." He repeated the phrase quietly to himself. If someone had looked closely, they would have noticed the way his hands slowly clenched into fists. Across the square, preparations for the afternoon parade were already underway. The village schoolchildren were lining up to perform a traditional dance, and the elders were preparing speeches about courage, freedom, and unity. The entire village was moving toward celebration. But Kofi was moving toward something else. Something none of them expected. A man named Baba Tund, one of the oldest storytellers in the village, watched Kofi carefully from his seat beneath the mango tree. Unlike the others, Baba Tund noticed small things people often missed. The tension in Kofi's shoulders. The way he looked at the flags fluttering above the market stalls. Baba Tund sighed quietly. "Today may not end the way people expect," he murmured. Nearby, two teenagers laughed as they hung colorful ribbons across the entrance to the square. "By sunset this place will be full," one of them said. And he was right. More villagers were already arriving from nearby farms and neighboring communities. Carts rolled in carrying food, musicians tuned their instruments, and the smell of roasted corn drifted through the warm air. Everything was perfect. Everything looked joyful. But inside Kofi, something had already begun to shift. He slowly turned away from the celebration and walked down the narrow path that led toward his workshop. Most people didn't notice. But one person did. The same young boy who had greeted him earlier had stopped at the edge of the road, watching curiously as Kofi disappeared behind the tall grass. Something about the man's expression had been strange. Not just serious, different. The boy frowned slightly, then ran off to join the parade practice. Meanwhile, inside the small wooden workshop at the far end of the village, Kofi pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dim, filled with tools, metal scraps, and unfinished repairs. He stood there silently for a long moment. Then he reached for something resting on the old wooden table. Outside, the celebration drums grew louder. Villagers danced. Children laughed. Voices continued calling out the same cheerful greeting across the square. Happy Independence. But no one knew what Kofi was holding in his hands. And no one could imagine what he was about to do next. The boy's heart began to beat faster as he stood quietly beside the tall grass near the workshop. Through the dusty window he could see Kofi moving slowly around the table. The man's back was turned, but the boy could clearly see something long and wrapped in cloth resting in Kofi's hands. It didn't look like any of the farming tools Kofi usually repaired. The boy swallowed nervously. He wasn't trying to spy. At least that's what he told himself. But something about the way Kofi had walked away from the Independence Day celebration had made him curious. Everyone else in the village was excited, laughing, preparing for the parade. Yet Kofi had looked like a man carrying a heavy storm inside his chest. Inside the workshop, Kofi carefully unwrapped the cloth. The boy leaned slightly closer to the window, trying to understand what he was seeing. For a moment he thought it might be some kind of old farming equipment. But then he noticed the metal surface beneath the cloth catching a bit of light. It looked old but polished. Kofi held it in both hands, examining it quietly, as if he was deciding something important. Outside, the distant drums grew louder as the parade practice continued. The entire village square was filling with people now. Women carried baskets of food to share, elders gathered under the trees, and children ran between the stalls waving their small flags proudly. Everywhere you went, people were greeting each other. Happy Independence. The words traveled through the warm air again and again. But inside the workshop, Kofi stood frozen with the object in his hands, his thoughts drifting far away from the cheerful voices outside. He remembered another Independence Day many years ago. Back then the celebrations had felt different. The village was smaller, but the hope people carried seemed larger. Everyone believed they were stepping into a new chapter of their history. Kofi had believed it too, even if he didn't say much. His brother Kojo had been the one full of energy. Kojo could speak for hours about the future, about building schools, expanding farms, and creating opportunities for the younger generation. You'll see, Kofi, Kojo used to say. One day this village will grow into something even better than we imagine. Malik always agreed loudly, clapping his hands and laughing. The three of them had made plans together. Plans to start a larger farming cooperative once the new land agreements were finalized. They talked about helping other villagers, sharing tools, growing more crops, and making sure no family struggled alone. For a while those dreams felt real. But slowly things began to change. The government announcements about land distribution grew confusing. Some families received good farmland. Others were told to wait. Meetings were held, but answers often felt unclear. And each time the village asked questions, the answers seemed to come from faraway offices that didn't understand the struggles of the people living there. Kojo had refused to stay quiet. He began traveling to nearby towns to attend meetings with other farmers. Sometimes he came back hopeful, other times frustrated. But he always believed that speaking up was the only way to protect the future they had been promised. Freedom means we can be heard, he told Kofi one night. But not everyone liked that idea. Kofi slowly set the metal object back onto the table and wrapped the cloth around it again. His face was calm, but there was tension in his movements. Outside the window, the boy shifted slightly, accidentally brushing the tall grass with his foot. The small rustling sound made Kofi pause. For a moment the workshop fell silent. Kofi turned his head slightly, listening. The boy quickly crouched lower, barely breathing. After a few seconds, Kofi continued moving around the room, though his steps were slower now. Something about the sound had caught his attention. Meanwhile, in the village square, the celebration was reaching its busiest moment of the morning. The chief had arrived, dressed in traditional cloth, greeting visitors from neighboring communities. Musicians gathered near the stage, preparing for the official Independence Day speeches that would begin soon. Baba Tund, the elderly storyteller, still sat under the mango tree watching everything carefully. His eyes occasionally drifted toward the narrow path leading to Kofi's workshop. Something in his heart felt uneasy. He had known Kofi and Kojo since they were young boys. He remembered their laughter, their arguments, their dreams about the future. He also remembered the day those dreams began to crack. Not everyone in the village liked talking about that time anymore. It was easier to focus on the celebration and the stories of victory. But Baba Tund understood that history often carried more than one truth. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his walking stick. Kofi, he murmured softly to himself. Back at the workshop, Kofi finally finished wrapping the cloth tightly around the metal object. He placed it inside a worn leather bag and closed the flap. His eyes moved toward the wooden box on the table again. The photograph. The faded flag. The old government paper. Pieces of a story the rest of the village no longer seemed to remember clearly. He hesitated for a moment, then gently placed the photograph back inside the box. Outside the window, the boy slowly stood again, curiosity still stronger than his fear. He watched as Kofi lifted the leather bag and slung it over his shoulder. Kofi then walked toward the door. The boy quickly stepped backward into the grass, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the man could hear it. The workshop door creaked open. Kofi stepped outside, scanning the path ahead of him. From where he stood, he could hear the distant cheers from the village square as the chief began greeting the crowd. "Happy Independence!" someone shouted loudly. The crowd cheered in response. Kofi looked toward the sound, his expression unreadable. Behind him, hidden in the grass, the boy noticed something strange. Kofi wasn't walking toward the celebration. He was walking in the opposite direction. And whatever was inside that leather bag seemed important enough to carry on a day when the entire village was gathered in one place. The boy hesitated for only a second. Then he quietly began following Kofi down the narrow path, unaware that the choices made in the next few moments might change the entire story of this Independence Day. Kofi walked steadily along the narrow dirt path that curved away from the village square. The sound of drums and laughter slowly faded behind him, replaced by the quiet rustling of dry grass and distant birds calling from the trees. The leather bag rested against his shoulder, swinging slightly with each step. Behind him, the boy followed at a careful distance. He didn't really know why he had decided to follow Kofi. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange feeling he had when he saw the man inside the workshop holding something wrapped in cloth. Whatever the reason, the boy moved quietly, trying not to step on twigs or loose stones. Up ahead, Kofi never looked back. But something in his posture made it clear that his mind was busy. His shoulders were tense, and his pace was faster than usual, as if he was trying to reach a place before something else happened. Back in the village square, the Independence Day celebration had reached its most exciting moment of the morning. The chief stood on the small wooden platform while villagers gathered around, waving flags and cheering. Musicians played louder, and children in colorful clothing lined up for their traditional dance. "Today we celebrate freedom," the chief began, raising his voice so everyone could hear. People clapped proudly. But beneath the mango tree, Baba Tund's attention was not fully on the speech. His eyes kept drifting toward the narrow path that led out of the village. Something didn't sit right in his heart. He had watched Kofi leave earlier. He had seen the way the man avoided the celebration. And after so many years of observing people, Baba Tund had learned that when someone carried silence like that on a day meant for joy, it often meant there was a deeper story waiting to surface. Meanwhile, Kofi continued walking until the path opened into an older part of the land, just beyond the farms. The area was quiet and rarely visited during celebrations. Tall trees surrounded the open ground, and the grass grew higher here, swaying slowly in the warm breeze. The boy stopped behind a large rock, watching carefully. Kofi stepped into the center of the clearing and finally slowed down. For a moment he simply stood there looking around. The place seemed important to him. Very important. The boy noticed something unusual about the ground nearby. There was an old wooden post sticking out of the earth, weathered and leaning slightly to one side. It looked like it had been there for many years. Kofi walked toward it slowly. His eyes were fixed on the post as if it carried memories only he could see. Back in the village, the chief continued speaking proudly about the history of independence, about unity, courage, and the strength of the people who fought for freedom. The crowd listened closely. But far away in the quiet clearing, Kofi reached the wooden post and placed his hand against it. The leather bag slipped gently from his shoulder. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind moved softly through the grass. Hidden behind the rock, the boy felt his chest tighten with nervous curiosity. He could sense that something serious was about to happen, even if he didn't fully understand what. Kofi slowly opened the leather bag. From inside he pulled out the cloth-wrapped object again. His hands were steady, but there was a heaviness in the way he moved, like a man carrying years of unspoken thoughts. As he unwrapped the cloth, the metal surface appeared once more, catching a small glint of sunlight. The boy leaned forward slightly, trying to see better. It looked like some kind of old tool or object made from polished metal, something carefully maintained even after all these years. Kofi stared at it quietly. His mind seemed to drift back through time again. This clearing had once been full of people. Many years ago, when the government officials first came to speak with the villagers about the land agreements after independence, they had gathered right here. Farmers from nearby areas stood together, listening carefully to promises about shared land, farming support, and opportunity. Kojo had stood near that same wooden post, speaking passionately about fairness and unity. Kofi remembered the way his brother's voice carried across the crowd that day. "This land belongs to the people who care for it," Kojo had said firmly. Many villagers had nodded in agreement. But not everyone. Some of the visiting officials had looked uncomfortable. Others avoided answering certain questions. And in the months that followed, the situation became complicated. Meetings turned into arguments. Promises became delays. Delays became silence. Kofi's grip tightened slightly on the metal object. The boy behind the rock noticed the change immediately. Even from a distance he could sense the weight of the moment building. Back in the village square, the crowd erupted into cheers as the children began their dance performance. Drums pounded louder, voices sang together, and colorful ribbons waved through the air. "Happy Independence!" someone shouted joyfully. But the celebration felt very far away from the quiet clearing where Kofi now stood. He walked slowly around the wooden post, studying the ground carefully. It was as if he was searching for something, or remembering exactly where something once happened. The boy felt his throat go dry. He realized now that this place must hold a story connected to Kofi's past, something the rest of the village didn't talk about anymore. Kofi stopped walking. He looked down at the ground beside the wooden post and slowly knelt. The metal object rested in his hands as he stared at the earth in silence. Behind the rock, the boy leaned closer, barely breathing. Whatever Kofi was about to do next felt important. So important that it seemed to carry years of anger, questions, and memories all at once. At that exact moment, a distant voice echoed faintly from the direction of the village. The chief had just finished his speech and the crowd was cheering again. The celebration was reaching its peak. But in the clearing, Kofi lifted the metal object slightly and looked at it one more time. His eyes hardened with determination. And just as he began to move his hands toward the ground beside the old wooden post, the boy suddenly realized something that made his heart pound even faster. Because the object Kofi was holding wasn't just an old tool. And whatever he planned to do with it right here, right now, could change the meaning of this Independence Day forever. Kofi stayed on his knees beside the old wooden post, the metal object still resting in his hands. For a long moment he didn't move. The breeze brushed through the tall grass, and somewhere above the trees a bird cried out, breaking the silence of the clearing. Behind the rock, the boy felt his legs starting to shake. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he could feel that something serious was about to unfold. Kofi looked like a man standing at the edge of a decision that had been building for many years. Slowly, Kofi pressed the metal edge into the ground. The soil was dry at first, but as he pushed deeper, the dirt began to loosen. He worked quietly, digging a small patch of earth beside the wooden post. Each movement seemed careful and deliberate, like he knew exactly where he needed to dig. The boy leaned forward, eyes wide. It looked like Kofi wasn't just digging randomly. He was digging in a place he had chosen long ago. Back in the village square, the celebration had grown even louder. Drums echoed across the fields and laughter carried through the air. The smell of roasted corn and grilled food drifted down the road as more villagers joined the Independence Day gathering. Children ran between the market stalls while elders told stories about the past. But even in the middle of the joyful noise, Baba Tund felt uneasy. He slowly stood from his seat beneath the mango tree, gripping his walking stick. His eyes once again turned toward the path that led away from the square. He couldn't explain it, but his heart kept pulling his thoughts back to Kofi. "I hope that man finds peace today," Baba Tund murmured quietly. Meanwhile, in the clearing, Kofi continued digging until the metal edge struck something harder beneath the soil. A dull sound echoed softly. Kofi froze. For a moment he just stared at the ground. Then he brushed away the loose dirt with his hands. The boy behind the rock held his breath. Bit by bit, something began to appear beneath the soil. It wasn't a stone. It looked like wood. Old wood. Kofi cleared more dirt away until the corner of a small buried box came into view. It looked even older than the one inside his workshop, its surface worn and dark from years underground. Kofi's breathing grew slower and deeper. The boy's heart raced. Whatever was inside that buried box had clearly been hidden here for a very long time. Kofi carefully loosened the soil around it and lifted the box from the ground. Dirt fell from its sides as he placed it gently beside the wooden post. For a moment he didn't open it. He simply stared at it as if the box carried memories heavier than its weight. Far away, the village drums grew louder again. The celebration parade had begun moving through the main road, with villagers dancing and singing proudly. Happy Independence, voices echoed across the fields. But those words felt distant here. Kofi slowly opened the old buried box. The lid creaked as it lifted. The boy shifted slightly behind the rock, trying to see what was inside. From where he crouched, he could only catch brief glimpses as Kofi moved his hands carefully through the contents. There were folded papers, a cloth bundle, and something wrapped in a piece of faded fabric. Kofi picked up the bundle first. His fingers moved slowly as he opened the cloth. Inside were more documents, their edges fragile with age. Some carried stamps and signatures, others were handwritten notes. Kofi stared at them for a long time. His face didn't show anger exactly. It showed something deeper. Years of unanswered questions. Years of waiting. The boy couldn't hear the words on the papers, but he could see how tightly Kofi held them. The man looked toward the old wooden post again. And suddenly the boy understood something. This clearing wasn't just an empty place outside the village. Something important had happened here long ago. Something the villagers rarely spoke about now. Kofi folded the papers carefully and placed them beside the box. Then he reached for the final item wrapped in the faded cloth. His hands hesitated slightly before opening it. Inside was a small wooden plaque. Even from the distance, the boy could see that words had been carved into its surface. Kofi brushed dirt away from the carving. The name at the center of the plaque was clear. Kojo. Kofi's brother. The boy's eyes widened. He suddenly remembered hearing the elders mention that name once before. Long ago, there had been a meeting here between villagers and officials about farmland rights after independence. But the meeting had not ended well. Something had gone wrong. Something serious enough that people stopped talking about it over time. Kofi's shoulders rose and fell slowly as he stared at the plaque. The wind moved again through the tall grass, carrying distant echoes of music from the celebration. Kofi looked back at the leather bag beside him. Then at the old buried box. Then at the wooden post standing silently in the ground. His jaw tightened. Behind the rock, the boy suddenly felt a strange mix of fear and understanding. Kofi hadn't come here randomly. He had come back to the exact place where his brother's story had ended. And whatever Kofi planned to do next seemed connected to the truth buried in those old documents. Back in the village square, Baba Tund had begun slowly walking toward the path leading out of the village. His instincts were pulling him in the same direction. Meanwhile, in the clearing, Kofi stood up slowly. The plaque with Kojo's name rested in his hand. His other hand reached toward the leather bag again. The boy watched every movement, his heart beating faster than ever. Because now it was clear that this moment had been waiting for many years. The celebration of independence continued in the distance. But here, beside the old wooden post and the buried memories beneath the soil, Kofi seemed ready to do something that could finally bring the past back into the light. And whatever decision he made in the next few moments might change how the entire village understood this day forever. Kofi stood silently beside the wooden post, the small plaque with Kojo's name resting in his hand. The clearing felt heavier now, as if the air itself carried the weight of memories buried under the soil for years. The old documents lay open beside the box, their corners fluttering slightly in the breeze. Behind the rock, the boy barely dared to breathe. He had never heard the full story about Kojo, but the way Kofi looked at the plaque made it clear that this place held something the village had forgotten, or maybe something people had chosen not to remember. Kofi slowly knelt again and placed the plaque gently against the wooden post. For a moment he closed his eyes. The sounds of the Independence Day celebration drifted faintly through the trees. Drums, cheering, laughter. The village was celebrating freedom and unity, yet here in the quiet clearing stood a man who seemed to carry a very different memory of that same history. Kofi opened his eyes and looked down at the documents again. He picked up one of the papers and unfolded it carefully. The boy could see the page trembling slightly in Kofi's hands. The paper was not just an old announcement like the one from his workshop. This one had signatures on it, several signatures. And one of those signatures belonged to someone very important in the village. Kofi stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tightening. For years, this document had been hidden beneath the ground, buried alongside the plaque in the small wooden box. It held details about the farmland agreement that had caused so much tension in the early days after independence. But the truth written on that page was not the story most villagers believed. The boy leaned forward slightly, trying to see the name that had caught Kofi's attention. But before he could make it out clearly, Kofi folded the paper again and placed it back in the box. His breathing had grown heavier. It was clear that whatever he had just read had stirred something powerful inside him. At that same moment, footsteps approached along the narrow path leading into the clearing. Slow, steady footsteps. The boy quickly ducked lower behind the rock. Kofi heard them too. He turned toward the path just as a familiar figure appeared between the tall trees. It was Baba Tund. The elderly storyteller paused at the edge of the clearing, leaning slightly on his walking stick. His wise eyes moved slowly across the scene, the dug-up soil, the open box, the documents, and the plaque resting against the wooden post. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved gently through the grass between them. Finally, Baba Tund sighed softly. "So, you came back here," he said. Kofi didn't answer right away. He simply watched the old man carefully. "I wondered how long it would take," Baba Tund continued, stepping closer. "Independence Day always brings old memories to the surface." Kofi's voice came out low and steady. "You knew about this place." It wasn't a question. Baba Tund nodded slowly. "I remember the day very clearly." The boy behind the rock felt his heart race. He had never seen two people speak with such heavy meaning in their words. Kofi gestured toward the wooden box. "And you knew about these documents too?" Baba Tund's expression grew serious. "Yes." Kofi's eyes hardened. "And you never told the village the truth?" The old man took a long breath before answering. "Some truths are complicated, Kofi." Kofi's voice sharpened slightly. "Complicated, or inconvenient?" The question hung in the air. Baba Tund looked toward the wooden plaque bearing Kojo's name. "That day changed many lives," he said quietly. People were angry, confused. The officials were making promises they were not ready to keep. Kofi stepped closer to him. "But that's not the whole story, is it?" Baba Tund didn't reply immediately. Instead, his eyes moved toward the documents lying beside the box. Kofi noticed the look. "You recognize the signature," he said. The old man closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." The boy leaned forward again, desperate to understand. Kofi picked up the paper and unfolded it once more, holding it where Baba Tund could see it clearly. "The agreement was changed," Kofi said. "Land that was meant for the village farms was reassigned." Baba Tund nodded slowly. "But the villagers were never told," Kofi continued. "And when Kojo discovered it, he tried to stop it." The wind grew stronger for a moment, rustling the trees above them. Baba Tund looked at Kofi with sadness in his eyes. "Your brother believed justice would win if the truth came out." Kofi's voice dropped to a near whisper. "But it didn't." The old man didn't argue. Instead, he spoke quietly. The situation became dangerous. There were people involved who didn't want the agreement exposed. Kofi clenched the paper tightly. "And the signature at the bottom," he said slowly, "belongs to someone who still stands in the village square today, giving speeches about freedom." The boy felt a chill run through his body. He suddenly understood the weight of those words. If the document was real, then someone respected in the village had been part of hiding the truth about the land agreement all those years ago. And today, on Independence Day, that same person was celebrating in front of the entire community. Baba Tund's voice softened. "Kofi, bringing this back now could tear the village apart." Kofi looked toward the distant direction of the celebration. That village was already torn apart the day the truth was buried here. Silence filled the clearing again. Then Kofi reached for the leather bag beside him. The boy's heart began pounding faster than ever. Because whatever Kofi had brought in that bag was clearly meant for this moment. And now that Baba Tund had arrived, the tension in the clearing had grown even heavier. Kofi slowly opened the bag. The old man watched carefully. The boy leaned forward behind the rock, barely blinking. Because the next thing Kofi pulled out could decide whether the truth stayed buried forever, or exploded into the middle of the Independence Day celebration waiting back in the village square. Kofi slowly reached inside the leather bag while Baba Tund watched him carefully. The old man's eyes were calm, but there was concern in them too. The wind moved quietly through the clearing, and the distant sounds of the Independence Day celebration continued to echo faintly through the trees. For a moment, it seemed like the entire world had slowed down. Then Kofi pulled something out of the bag. It was not a weapon. It was not a tool. It was a small wooden frame. Baba Tund leaned forward slightly as Kofi turned it toward the light. Inside the frame was another photograph, but this one was different from the old one inside Kofi's workshop. This photograph showed the gathering that had taken place in this very clearing many years ago. Villagers stood around the wooden post, officials in formal clothing stood nearby, and at the center of the picture was Kojo speaking to the crowd. But that wasn't what made the photo important. Kofi held it closer so Baba Tund could see clearly. In the background of the photograph, standing beside the government officials, was a man who now stood proudly in the village square every year during the Independence Day celebration. The village chief. Baba Tund let out a slow breath. "Yes," he said quietly. "I remember when that photo was taken." Kofi's voice was steady but filled with years of weight. "He was there when the agreement changed." Baba Tund nodded slowly. "Yes." The boy behind the rock felt his heart race faster. The cheerful voice of the chief from the village square earlier that morning suddenly echoed in his memory. "Today we celebrate freedom?" But here in the clearing the story sounded very different. Kofi placed the photograph beside the documents in the box. Then he looked directly at Baba Tund. "For years he told the village that Kojo caused trouble," Kofi said. "He told everyone my brother misunderstood the agreement." The old man sighed. That was the story people accepted. Kofi's eyes hardened. But it wasn't the truth. Silence stretched between them again. Finally Baba Tund asked the question that had been waiting in the air since he arrived. "What do you plan to do with it?" Kofi looked down at the photograph, the documents, and the plaque bearing Kojo's name. "Today the entire village is celebrating independence," he said. "They are cheering for leaders who talk about unity and freedom." His voice grew firmer. "But freedom without truth means nothing." The old man watched him carefully. "And if you reveal this now?" Baba Tund asked. Kofi looked toward the distant village square where the drums and cheering continued. "Then the village will finally hear what really happened here." The boy behind the rock felt a sudden wave of nervous energy. He imagined the celebration stopping, people turning toward the stage, the chief being confronted with the old documents. The entire village would be shocked. Kofi picked up the wooden plaque and brushed the last bit of dirt from Kojo's name. "My brother believed people deserved the truth," he said quietly. Then he began placing the documents, the photograph, and the plaque back inside the leather bag. Baba Tund watched every movement. "So you are going back to the village?" the old man said. Kofi nodded. "Yes." The wind rustled the tall grass again as he closed the bag. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Baba Tund surprised him. "I will walk with you." Kofi looked at him, slightly surprised. "You knew about this all these years?" he said. "Yes," Baba Tund replied. "And perhaps it is time the silence ended." Behind the rock, the boy quickly stood up as the two men began walking back toward the path leading to the village. He stayed hidden at first, letting them walk ahead. His mind raced with everything he had just seen. The documents. The photograph. The truth about Kojo. The Independence Day celebration suddenly felt like it was about to change forever. As they walked, the sounds of music and cheering grew louder. The village square was alive with excitement. People were dancing, vendors were serving food, and children ran between the stalls waving their flags proudly. On the stage at the center of the square, the chief was preparing to speak again. "Today we remember the sacrifices that built our freedom," his voice echoed across the crowd. Just then, Kofi and Baba Tund stepped onto the edge of the square. A few villagers noticed them first. "Look," someone whispered. "Kofi has come." Others turned to watch. It was rare for Kofi to join the Independence Day celebration. The boy who had followed them slipped quietly into the crowd, his eyes locked on the leather bag hanging from Kofi's shoulder. The chief noticed the movement too. He paused mid-sentence as his gaze settled on Kofi walking toward the stage. For a brief moment, something strange passed across the chief's face. Recognition. Kofi stopped near the front of the gathering. The music slowly faded as people sensed something unusual was happening. Even the children stopped dancing. The entire village square grew quiet. Kofi stepped forward. He slowly opened the leather bag. Villagers leaned closer, curious. Baba Tund stood beside him silently. The chief watched carefully from the stage. Kofi reached inside the bag and pulled out the old documents. Then the photograph. Then the wooden plaque with Kojo's name carved into it. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some of the older villagers looked shocked. A few recognized the plaque immediately. Kofi raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "For years we have celebrated freedom," he said. The crowd listened closely. "But today," he continued, "I want the village to remember someone whose story was buried along with the truth." He lifted the plaque. "My brother Kojo." A ripple of whispers moved through the people. The chief's expression tightened. Kofi began unfolding the document that carried the signature. The moment everyone had been waiting for was finally here. But just as he was about to reveal it, Baba Tun gently placed a hand on his arm. The movement surprised both Kofi and the crowd. The old man stepped forward slowly, turning to face the villagers. His voice, though aged, carried clearly across the square. "There is something else you must know before these papers are read." The crowd grew even quieter. Kofi looked at him, confused. Baba Tun took a long breath. Then he said the words that no one expected. "Kojo did uncover the truth about the land agreement, but the man who helped him hide these documents was not the chief." A wave of confusion spread through the crowd. Kofi stared at the old man. "What are you saying?" Baba Tun looked directly at him. "The person who buried this box to protect the truth." His voice lowered slightly. "Was your brother himself." Gasps rose from the villagers. Kofi felt the ground shift beneath his understanding. "Kojo buried them?" he asked. Baba Tun nodded slowly. "Yes." Because he believed the village was not ready for the truth back then. The square fell into stunned silence. And now, standing in the middle of the Independence Day celebration with the entire village watching, Kofi realized the truth he had carried for years might not be the whole story after all. The village square stood in complete silence after Baba Tun's words. The drums had stopped. The laughter had faded. Even the wind seemed to pause as people tried to understand what they had just heard. Kofi remained frozen where he stood, the document still open in his hands. For years he had carried anger inside him, believing the truth had been stolen from his brother. But now the story he believed so strongly was suddenly shifting. "You're saying Kojo buried the documents himself?" Kofi asked slowly. Baba Tun nodded, his eyes gentle but firm. "Yes," he said. "He buried them here beside the wooden post on the night after that meeting." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Many of the older villagers looked confused, while the younger ones leaned closer, trying to understand the history that had been hidden for so long. Kofi shook his head slightly. "But why would he do that?" he asked. "If the agreement was wrong, if the land was being taken from the villagers, why hide the proof?" Baba Tun took a step forward and looked out at the people gathered in the square. "That night was chaotic," he said. Voices were raised, tempers were high. Some villagers wanted to confront the officials immediately. Others feared the conflict would divide the community before independence had even begun to settle. The old man paused, remembering the past clearly. "Kojo believed the truth mattered," he continued. "But he also believed the village needed time. He worried that exposing everything in that moment would break the unity people had just fought so hard to achieve." Kofi listened carefully, the leather bag still hanging from his shoulder. "So he buried the truth?" he asked quietly. Baba Tun nodded again. "He told me he would reveal it one day, when the village was strong enough to face it without turning against itself." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd again. Some people looked toward the village chief, who still stood on the stage watching everything unfold. The chief's face had grown serious, but he did not interrupt. Kofi looked down at the wooden plaque with his brother's name carved into it. "For all these years," he said slowly, "I believed the truth was being hidden from us." Baba Tun stepped closer and placed a hand gently on Kofi's shoulder. "In a way it was," the old man said. "But not for the reasons you thought." Kofi took a deep breath. The anger that had lived inside him for so long didn't disappear instantly, but something inside him began to soften. His brother had not been silenced by others the way Kofi had always believed. Kojo had made the choice himself. The boy who had followed Kofi earlier stood quietly among the villagers, watching everything with wide eyes. The mystery that had started with one man walking away from the Independence Day celebration had now become a story the entire village was hearing together. Kofi slowly turned to face the crowd. Many villagers were now looking at the documents in his hands. "These papers are real," Kofi said. "They show that the farmland agreement was changed years ago." People shifted uneasily, but they continued listening. "The land that was meant for the village farms was partly reassigned to outside companies," he explained. "Kojo discovered it and wanted people to know." The chief finally stepped down from the stage and walked closer to the crowd. Everyone watched him carefully. When he spoke, his voice was calm. "I remember that meeting," the chief said. I was younger then, and many of the decisions were made by officials far above the village level. He looked toward the documents in Kofi's hand. Kojo confronted them that day, the chief continued. He demanded answers. Some of the older villagers nodded, remembering those tense early years after independence. But the officials promised they would review the agreement later, the chief said. Kojo believed exposing the documents immediately might lead to conflict with the government while the village was still vulnerable. Kofi listened carefully. So he chose patience, he said. Yes, Baba Tund replied softly. He hoped the next generation would be strong enough to face the truth together. The crowd grew thoughtful. For years, Independence Day in the village had been about celebration, music, and stories of freedom. But now the day carried a deeper meaning. Freedom was not just about the past. It was also about honesty. Kofi slowly folded the document again. My brother believed the truth would one day help the village grow stronger, he said. He looked out across the crowd. Maybe today is that day. The chief nodded respectfully. If the documents show that land decisions were unfair, he said, then we should discuss them openly as a community. Villagers began speaking quietly among themselves. Some looked surprised, others thoughtful, but no one seemed angry. Instead, there was a feeling of reflection moving through the square. The boy watched Kofi closely. The man who had walked away from the celebration earlier that morning no longer looked filled with the same quiet anger. He looked like someone finally understanding a story that had been incomplete for many years. Kofi picked up the wooden plaque once more. Kojo believed in independence, he said. Not just independence from outsiders, but independence in how we face our own mistakes and our own truths. He turned toward Baba Tund. Thank you for telling the whole story. The old storyteller smiled gently. Stories are meant to guide us, he said. But they must be told honestly. The chief turned back toward the stage and raised his voice so the entire village could hear. Today we celebrate independence, he said. But today we also remember that freedom requires courage, not just to fight for it but to protect it with truth. The crowd slowly began clapping. The tension that had filled the square started to fade, replaced by something stronger. Understanding. Kofi placed the documents carefully back inside the leather bag. The celebration did not end that day. In fact, the music slowly returned, the drums began to beat again, and the children started dancing once more. But something had changed. From that Independence Day forward, the villagers remembered Kojo not just as a man from the past, but as someone who believed the truth would guide the future. And as the sun began to lower over the village square, Kofi finally heard the words that had once filled him with bitterness. Happy independence. This time he nodded quietly, because now he understood what those words truly meant.